So a standard thesis in epistemology is that knowledge is very powerful by itself. So knowledge, for instance, is said to be able to warrant proper assertion, proper action, proper reasoning. In some of my previous work, I challenged this by saying that there's a distinction between the quantity question in epistemology and what I call the quality question. So, for instance, to the extent that there are debates about knowledge in epistemology, whether it can, for instance, warrant action, it tends to be on the quantity spectrum. So some have argued, no, knowledge is too strong, we can have justified belief. Others have argued knowledge is too weak, we need certainty. But all of the debates have taken place along the quantity spectrum. And in earlier work, I argued that it can also matter for what we do in the world, epistemically, that there's a particular kind of knowledge that's important. In some of my earlier work, I focused on the importance of first-handedness in some contexts. Like, for instance, in certain contexts of expertise, if you go see a specialist, it matters not just that the doctor has a high degree of epistemic support for telling you what your diagnosis is, but if the person is a specialist, you expect that the testimony you're receiving has a first-hand basis of some sort. And so I think that the epistemological landscape needs to expand to consider this. In some of my very recent work, I am looking again at the question of quality, but interestingly, I'm focusing on the epistemic benefits of secondhandedness. And I think the deeper point that I want to make is that in addition to the quantity-quality distinction, we also need to look at the process whereby the knowledge was acquired. So there have been, over the years, a number of philosophers who have argued that, for instance, it doesn't make sense to talk about moral experts, that we can't learn from people various moral truths. Ernie Souza published a book recently making a similar claim that first-handedness is especially important when it comes to moral knowledge, that we need to grasp in a way the why or the reasons ourselves. And when we don't, when we just say defer to somebody's testimony, then we end up with something like truncated understanding. In some of my recent work, I explore the epistemic risks with first-handedness in the moral domain, but more importantly, I explore some benefits of what I'm calling second-handedness. But again, the main argument I want to make is that process matters. And on that point, I look at how the moral knowledge is acquired from other people. So I ask people to consider just kind of a paradigmatic case. So imagine, and this case is a lot of the details of this case is grounded in a real person's life, but I'm taking some liberties with some details to convey the point more clearly. So consider a 15-year-old young Black male who is brought into an interrogation room by himself and interrogated by several white police officers. And they use interrogation tactics that they have been trained to use. They don't physically harm the 15-year-old. He gets bathroom breaks and water. And there's a recording of the interrogation. And the recording is shown to jurors, and they're asked to determine whether the confession that he ultimately gives at the end of the interrogation was coerced. So part of the case is imagining that this young 15-year-old Demetrius ends up confessing falsely to a carjacking and murder in Chicago. And I ask whether the jurors should just look at the recording and form a first-hand judgment about whether the confession was coerced and is therefore unjust on the basis of the recording. So just using their own first-hand resources, or whether it's better to have second-hand knowledge where they listen to Demetrius. There are various worries with them just going at it alone. In such a case, I argue. One is that it could be a very epistemically impoverished situation where they are missing crucial facts about Demetrius's firsthand perspective. So for instance, coercion, there's lots of characterizations of coercion, but they all involve something about the psychology of the person being coerced. Offering someone irresistible incentives, for instance. And it's important to understand what is irresistible to the subject before we can make sense out of whether the subject was coerced. And so I first argue that the situation is impoverished because we need to know things about Demetrius's psychology before we can determine whether the confession was coerced. We also need to know various things about his subjective perspective, perhaps something that would seem irresistible to one person might not seem irresistible to another, depending on their background, depending on whether you lived in an over-policed community, depending on whether you had experienced, negative interactions with police officers in the past, and so on. But the more important issue that I want to make in this work is that there are distinctive benefits to what I'm calling the talking, listening, and learning process. So the debate about moral knowledge and moral expertise is usually framed around two options. Not that I don't want to suggest that the proponents think that these are the only options, but this is the way that the debate is framed. Should we prefer firsthand inquiry, where we do it alone, where I literally just kind of use my own resources to try to arrive at a moral judgment, or do we defer to other people's testimony? And one of the things that I want to do is create space for, in a way, like having a third option on the table. And that's what I'm calling the talking, listening, and learning process. So I draw on a lot of literature. Much of it is in psychology, but there's also some literature in political science about the distinctive benefits of interpersonal exchanges. So a lot of the literature is centered around conversation, but we can just think about interpersonal exchanges more broadly. A bigger project that I'm working on right now is the epistemically reparative value of listening to people's stories. And so picking up on that, there's a lot of literature that says that an interpersonal exchange can be by itself epistemically generative. So on just the speaker side, there's a lot of evidence that shows that just talking can be epistemically generative. So the process of talking out loud about one's experience can itself generate new knowledge. So we can imagine Demetrius, for instance, first thinking about what happened to him as where he focuses on his own role in it. And he focuses on the fact that he did end up saying that he did something he didn't in fact do. And on that, but as he talks out loud about the experience, we can imagine this, years later. Demetrius is now in his 30s. And we can imagine the listener having particular listener responses. We can imagine his own story changing in ways that get closer to the truth and generate knowledge. I'm not saying all interpersonal exchanges get closer at the truth, but some do. And so we can imagine Demetrius moving from a conception of what happened, where he focused on his own role in it, to one where he focused on the coercive component of the interrogation. And so the process of talking, listening, and learning is one where new moral knowledge can be generated because the person who had the experience firsthand is talking, getting listener responses. And both of those, the talking and the interpersonal exchange where they're getting listener responses, can, what some people call, co-construct a story that is closer to the truth and that is generative of new knowledge that couldn't have been had beforehand. And so in this way, someone like a reporter or a journalist or a juror who's trying to go at it alone simply couldn't have access to that knowledge because it was generated by the process of the interpersonal exchange.